This is Warren Vanderhill interviewing Raphael Crystal, January 3, 2003, for the Muncie Jewish Oral History Project 2. Rafe, I'd like to begin by thanking you for your willingness to participate in this study. What I've been asking all of the people I've interviewed is a kind of beginning general question, which really has to do with you coming to Muncie, Indiana, and what other options you might have had when you decided to first come here.
Well, I came to Muncie, and this was in the fall of 1994, to work in the Department of Theater and Dance, teaching musical theater. At that point, I was in New York City, and I was actually basically a freelance musician doing some part-time teaching. And I had decided at this point in my life that it was that would be interesting to try full-time teaching, and this is a particular field, musical theater, where there really aren't that many positions that come up, and so that year I don't know that there was even anything else. On the other hand, I did have to give up some things I was doing in New York. And so really the choice for me was whether to give up that. In fact, something interesting had just come up involving teaching at my old high school of music and art in New York. But I decided that this was more interesting. And at that time also, my wife was working on a PhD, and it seemed as if getting out of the city for a year or two would be a good time for her to finish that.
Okay.
So that's how we had to come here. At the time, we thought it was for a year, and ever since then, it's been kind of extended year by year, or then in larger units. So, and we still have our apartment in New York, so it's been a sort of incremental move, you might say.
What did you think of Muncie when you first came here? Because I'm making the assumption that you hadn't spent a lot of time in the Midwest before you came here.
Well, Muncie's hard to get a handle on. It's not the city, it's not the country. And I had spent most of my life in New York. My wife grew up in the country in Connecticut, and suddenly we're in this place that doesn't look like either. And so as far as that goes, and the downtown is not exactly there, and the people you meet at Ball State, for the most part, aren't from Muncie. And so actually it was very hard to get a handle on the whole thing. Not to mention the East Central Indiana landscape, very different from anything that either of us were accustomed to. So even that, getting a handle on how things looked and who lived where, it was a little hard, and still is. It's kind of elusive even now. Muncie, I think, is a little hard. I ask people, well, all of this building that's going on right outside of these luxury homes, who lives there? Nobody has been able to tell me even now. So I think that in Muncie maybe is a cutting-edge place, and that it's not so easy to define it. One thing we have noticed is in the time that we've come here, a lot of things that we first encountered in Muncie, especially as far as restaurants and chain stores, have been showing up in New York. So we refer to that as the Muncification of New York. And so I think that actually, yeah, it's not an easy place to get a handle on if you come from other places. And so that's kind of interesting.
Well, have your views of Muncie changed in the years that you've been here?
Yeah, of course. Well, of course, I've gotten a little bit more used to it. I've gotten involved in various ways with aspects of the city as well as with the university. So now it's kind of a terrain that's a little bit more familiar to me.
Sure. How would you describe your life as a member of a Jewish community, and it might be Jewish communities, though I know in your case it's New York City, before you came to Muncie?
Well, that gets into a very interesting series of observations. Before coming to Muncie, I had never been a member of a synagogue, and as a matter of fact, had gone to synagogue very rarely. As in fact, I'm really a very constant attender here either. So My relationship to the Jewish community was quite different. I was involved in Jewish cultural and political, you might say, events, but not as a member of a congregation. So my story is actually rather interesting in that respect. I was involved in Jewish things, first of all, because my father was a Yiddish writer. He was an editor of a big Yiddish paper and then of a magazine, and so from all my life I was surrounded by that. And I did not go to religious school, but I went to Yiddish schools where you learn some Yiddish, not too well actually. And so then so I've always been actually quite close to that. Then later, as a child, then much later in life, I became involved with the Jewish community in another way because I wrote a series of shows on Jewish subjects. I became associated with a theater called the Jewish Repertory Theater, an off-Broadway theater in New York. And the thing that the most successful show that I wrote, which became a kind of off-Broadway hit, was based on a Yiddish play called Kuni Lemel. And so in the process of doing that, I actually revisited things that I hadn't looked at in some time and actually relearned some Yiddish and did research on it and so on. And then became involved with the Jewish community in that way. And like I also, around the same time, this was just in sort of the 10 years before coming here, wrote some shows for the United Jewish Appeal in New York, and that again involved me in doing research and in becoming familiar with things. So I was quite involved then culturally and however you want to say, nationally or politically with Jewish matters, but not religiously, because that whole Jewish secular culture that actually my father was a part of, while it has had an interesting kind of relationship to the religious aspect of Judaism, it was a complicated relationship since these people generally were not religious. So that was my, of course, my grandfather was religious, and in fact, I have a cousin who became a rabbi, to the shock of his family. that was actually part of the 60s, 70s rebellion. So at any rate, I had a relationship to the Jewish community that was actually a very important part of my life, but it was not to a congregation. It was not really on the basis of religious observance. I came here, and should I just
Yeah,
go on?
sure. Well, let me ask you one more question. Did you grow up in Manhattan or Brooklyn?
No, I grew up in the Bronx.
In the Bronx, okay.
Right.
What part?
Specifically, until I was 9, we lived at Kingsbridge and Sedgwick Avenues across from the Veterans Hospital, and then we moved up to right at the edge of the Van Cortlandt Park to a cooperative housing project, the amalgamated houses, which again was very much part of the Jewish world. It was sponsored by one of the unions, one of the clothing unions that was largely Jewish, and in fact it's all interrelated. Those projects in their early years received a lot of support from the Yiddish newspaper, The Forward, that my father wrote for, so it was all part of a certain world. And then I grew up in the Bronx. I went to the High School of Music and Art, which is in Manhattan, but I commuted myself. And then it was only, after college that I moved to Manhattan. And of course, that was like moving to the city from the country. And when I grew up in the Bronx, we lived very much at the edge of the city, and it was, actually, Muncie reminds me of the Bronx in many ways.
Yeah, I was going to say, then Cortlandt Park reminds me of that area.
Right, yes. But the Bronx then was a little bit more rural, in a sense.
That's true. I would agree.
But actually, that's where I grew up,
well, you actually got into the next question, which is, what has your life been like as a member of the Jewish community since you came here?
Well, so that's the interesting thing. That coming here, and I've still remained, I still have some of the other connections, because the shows that I've written continue. We had a revival of that Kuni Lemel in New York a few years ago, which was
You want to spell that for me?
K-U-N-I-L-E-M-L K-U-N-I-L-E-N-L, until recently on sale at the Wall State Bookstore.
K-U-N-I-L-E-N-L.
M-L.
M-L.
Yeah, right.
That's more for the person transcribing
Right,
the interview.
Right. And so that continues to have quite a few productions, and including a big one a few years ago, and which really had me back and forth between Muncie and New York for a greater part of the semester. Right. And some other shows I've written, all on Jewish subjects, also are done quite a bit. And so I'm still involved in that aspect of things. In fact, right now there's a production in Florida that I can't do because I have to be here, right. But I have to go home and get together the material to send it to you. Right. And that's based on material from the Yiddish theater. It's actually a kind of review. Mm-hmm. So I've been involved with those things. But when we came to Muncie, I guess anecdotally is the best way to tell.
Sure.
The first, at the beginning of the year, with the high holidays, I took it into my head, and I guess this happens often with Jews if they're in a place where, because I wouldn't have done this in New York. I wouldn't have necessarily gone to a synagogue.
When you're an alien culture.
Right. Or although I might have, because of course, when it starts to, be interested in things. But I just thought, oh, well, I'll look in the yellow pages and see if there's a synagogue here. And of course there was, and I called up and found out that where they were and went to their high holiday services. Now, why did I do that is an interesting thing. I guess I was certainly curious, what would a synagogue in Muncie be like? I also realized that in the Midwest, one of the ways that you get to know people and such is through religious organizations, and since I wasn't going to go to a church, I would go to a synagogue. And as a matter of fact, the synagogue remains one of the places in Muncie, one of the few places where I meet people from Muncie. Because I realized right away that at Ball State, very few people were from here. And I had already become curious about, well, what is this town like? And I see none of my colleagues, with few exceptions, are from here, and very few of my students, too. Right. So it was a way of finding out something a little bit more about, you might say, the other side of the tracks, right. Or the other part. And plus, I was curious to see what it was. And so we went down. Well, once we went down there, people, of course, were interested. They're always looking for members. And so the person who was the membership director of the synagogue at that time was Ken Davis. He got in touch with me right away. And he said, well, how would you like to join? Now, this was very interesting because I had never, as I said, been a member of a synagogue. And my wife is not Jewish. So I said to him, well, I'm not very religious. And I said, I'm not religious. He said, oh, well, that's all right. I said, well, I don't know if I would attend services very often. Oh, that's all right. I said, and I don't think I'm going to be available for committee work. He said, well, that's okay. We'll see. And I said, plus, we can't really pay much in the way of dues. That's all right. We have a complete expense. So everything I said to him was all right. And so finally, either he or I said, so why not? And so I did join, because it seemed as if whatever I said was just fine. So that was interesting in itself. And I think it would not necessarily have happened in other places. So I think there was something about the particular community and the particular synagogue that made it likely or possible for me to join it.
Was it the first time you've been a member then of a temple congregation?
Yes, right. And so once I did, of course, then I became involved, as always happens with musicians, with the musical life. And then I saw that there was very active musical life there because of people from the university, and also because of Larry Francer, who is sort of one of the central figures, and who I had certain things in common with because he came from a musical theater background himself. So I became involved in the musical life of the temple. And again, had it not been for that, it's hard to say exactly what would have happened. But it then became a sort of, I would say, I guess, a creative outlet for me, a way to pursue actually some of the interests I'd already had in some other ways. I mean, I had written some things with Hebrew texts, actually, in connection with some things I wrote for the United Jewish Appeal in New York. And so I was kind of interested in doing that. Not that I don't really know Hebrew, but so exploring that was something, and so I began to write certain pieces that were used in the service and for certain events. And so consequently, I've been very much involved in that aspect of the temple's life. And it's changed my resume. I now have a category of sacred music on my resume, which I never did before, because I've written every year one or two things. And so it actually has become an important part of my creative life. For many, and I'm in the position of many musicians, of course, who are not necessarily that religious, but get involved in religion through the musical side of it. And one of the things that has been of special interest to me, and this has to do with the New Year's resolution that you prompted, is that I've set certain parts of the Passover Seder. Now the Muncie congregation has a rather elaborate Passover Seder that they have every year. And this is something that I did have a relationship to, although I was not, as I said, a synagogue goer, so the synagogue service is not quite as sort of an ingrained thing with me. But my family always did have a Passover Seder, so that's always something that was part of my background, part of my sort of mental terrain, and I've always had in mind actually doing something musical with parts of it. And so this has been a good opportunity to do it, and now my New Year's resolution is to get back, because that's kind of an ongoing project. And when you called me, I started to think, well, what has been my relationship to the synagogue, and I realized, well, this particular project is a very central one, and so my resolution is to get back to that.
So it'd be fair in responding to part of my next question, I think you've already touched upon it. If I pose the question, how important is Temple Bethel in your life today, that's essentially what you've already spoken about.
Yeah, I would say that, surprisingly enough, it's quite important. And at certain times of the year, because of the musical events, I spend a certain amount of time rehearsing things and writing things. And it's become an important part, actually, as I said, of my musical life.
A little bit of a shift. In the first study that we did of the Muncie Jewish community, one of the major issues that all of the participants in that study brought up was relationships in the Muncie community between Jewish people and non-Jewish people. And I guess I'm asking people who are involved in this study if they think that question is really much of an issue now 23 years later. It was a very, very big issue for the generation that I've come to call the Marty Schwartz generation. And I just wonder, in the short time that you've been in Muncie, how you have seen relationships between Jewish people in this community and non-Jewish people.
Well, I think it still is probably an important issue for the Jews. I don't know if it's an important issue for anybody else, actually. But it's more. I think it's not as simple, and it's not as much. It's not as you might say on the surface. So I don't know that it's how to answer that. And bear in mind that I'm still, in some ways, because of my particular trajectory, I'm still not a complete Muncieite.
Yeah. Oh no, that's true. Sure, yeah.
I don't know. That
I'm not sure I am, and I lived there 37 years. Yeah.
For people who are Jewish in Muncie, I think, as for people, Jews anywhere, the question of their status, their identity as Jews, and how that makes them different from other people, how that conditions their relations with other people, I think is an issue. For me, for instance, one thing, as I said, is that I think in a community like Muncie, more than in say, New York, people are defined by their relationship to religious institutions. So for me, I would say that being part of the synagogue has made me feel more a part of Muncie, and has also, as I say, it's one of the few places where I meet people whose families go back, and so it's a way for me personally of having a little bit of an understanding of the city itself, and I've been a little bit interested in knowing this about Muncie. So it's a way. I think that the Jews, as far as I know, the Jews have been in Muncie for a long time. There have not been too many of them, but in a way, it's interesting. It's different from, say, New York. The Jews are sort of as much old settlers in Muncie as anybody else, and so the question of the city, its history, the community, and being Jewish are related. Right. And so it's a way of being related to it, I would say, if that's an answer.
Yeah, okay. Well, let me take that one step one step beyond, because, of course, what I'm really trying to get at in some ways with that question is whether or not here or elsewhere in your life you've experienced either covert or overt anti-Semitism.
Well, it's a funny thing, of course, because you grow up always hearing about it and thinking about it, and you don't necessarily experience it. So I don't know that I've experienced it here. I've certainly heard about it in the past, and and of course, most recently there was an incident of some anti-Semitic graffiti that appeared at the temple, and there, in a very sort of chilling way, it was interesting because it happened just a few days before the 9/11 attacks, and it seemed like almost a kind of indicator of a mood, although it may not be that ill. And of course, in a place like Muncie, where the history of the area has the component of the history of the Klan and so on. So you certainly think that being Jewish in Muncie has had a problematical side. Personally, I have not, as far as I know, I haven't experienced any anti-Semitic things, but in our present world, one doesn't necessarily. Certainly not a place like Muncie, I would think. I think it's a complicated question. I know that there have been there were exclusionary covenants and so on. But anyway, also you got to think of something like a person like Marty Schwartz saying, and I can understand this very well, that when he went to Harvard, he was shocked by some anti-Jewish attitudes, and his attitude was, well, I don't have to take this. I'm from Muncie, and so it's an interesting question as to whether it's a more or less hospitable atmosphere.
Well, I think it's more hospitable now, certainly. I mean, the passage of 23 years from the time I first did these interviews is a significant amount of time, because with the first group of people I spoke with, this was really a pretty raw issue, because not just the Klan as a visible presence during the 1920s, but more significantly, the Marty Schwartz generation back then still had vivid memories of the fact that they couldn't join certain clubs, and more importantly, they couldn't live in certain places in Muncie where they wanted to live. And so you wouldn't get too far into the interviews that I had then before people would say, I really would have liked to have purchased a home here.
Really.
And you're really talking about the Westwood area, adjacent to campus, and areas that are the Gatewood area and a couple of others. And so you get 20, 30 minutes into some of these interviews, and then that would come up. Or you get people who would say, gee, I really would have liked to have been a member of the Delaware Country Club. I would have liked to have been a member of Rotary. And at that point, there were real barriers. Now, those barriers aren't there. I'm not saying that there certainly are not elements of anti-Semitism in any community, but they just aren't thrown in your face the way they were.
So you're not aware of it.
Yeah.
But this would be true,
I think
most
it's true.
places.
Yeah, I would agree. A question based more on the future. A couple of these will be from this point on. How do you personally view or see the future of Temple Bethel?
Well, actually, we were talking about this before. I would say it is a difficult question because there are already not enough people, and if the numbers decline too much, it's hard to maintain a synagogue or a community with activities. So I guess it partly depends on what happens in Muncie in general, even on what happens with Ball State. I guess Ball State is not going to get much bigger, so there isn't going to be a tremendous influx of people. But something else might happen that would change the population patterns a little bit in Muncie. But if it didn't, then I would see less and less of the sort of old families of the Jewish community, and more of the Jewish community would be people who come here either permanently or temporarily as working for the hospital or the university or the new industrial conglomerates that will spring up. I mean, you don't know, but who knows? Yeah. But so I think that it's a question really of where would the people come from, and so there are, of course, it seems to me, more Jews in Muncie who are not members of the temple. Would they, and the people always wonder, well, is there a way of attracting them? Is there a way of broadening the membership? Because I would imagine there is potential for somewhat more members. I don't think there are that many Jews at the university or in the hospital, but there are some. So then the question would be, is there a way in which the temple could become more inclusive? Yeah. And I don't know. That depends, I guess, on just trends in general. Are people going to be more interested in religion or more interested in Jewish identity or less? Would the temple move in the direction of becoming more of a community center and integrate people who were not as interested in religious activities? That might be one thing. I mean, obviously that's happened in some places. But I think it's hard. It's very dicey. It's, after all, an area that is losing population in general.
Well, I think one indication of that, to me anyway, comparing this study with the one I did more than 2 decades ago, is the friendliness, I guess I would say, the outreach that the congregation seems to be making to non-Jewish spouses.
Right.
Of which there are several in terms of the people who are members.
Right. It's very, it's especially open in that way. And I would say that's one of the reasons that it's been easy for me to be a part of it. In fact, my wife has even been an officer of the temple. So that is certainly something that, and of course it's a Reform temple, and that means that their outlook is inclusive and liberal, and that has been another reason why it's been easy for me in many ways to be a part of it, and even to write music that might play around a little bit with some elements of liturgy. And I know it's even been an issue in the temple of how open to be, and it seems that the more liberal opinion has won for the moment, and probably it will remain that way, unless there's another religious revival that sweeps the Jewish community as well. And I would say that would come, now that Neil Weintraub isn't here anymore, that would come from students. I have a sense that some of the students, there aren't that many, that some of the Jewish students are a little bit more conservative in their point of view about these things than the older members of the congregation. So you might actually see, if there were to be any debate about these things, it would come, I think, from the students, and that would be an interesting development.
It would be an interesting development. Of course, I think that would be a wonderful development for Ball State to have more conservative Jewish students here. I think it would add a very good dimension to the student body, which we've not had in the years I've been here.
Well, it depends what you mean by it. I mean, it would be an interesting thing to have a kind of more religiously conservative element. I don't know how that would. And
well, it'd be a little dicey, I think.
It would be. It would be
people
strange.
Who are the core members right now.
Right, and it would probably be again. It would be part of a larger development. So I mean, because all of those things are possible. But other than that, as far I think the future of it is dicey. Actually, I'm not familiar with the finances of the temple, so I mean, there's a very nice building, and now the facilities have been expanded, and it's, the question is whether there are going to be people to use the building.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because I know a lot of what you do is performed in that addition, and so I pose this question to you: how important do you think to the future of Temple Bethel is the building addition?
Well, obviously it's important. It's almost as if it was a kind of a hopeful move, sort of. Well, it was two things. First of all, it was just a modernization, which all religious institutions do. I mean, it gives it a social home, more or less, like ones that churches have. So, for people who grew up in a somewhat earlier time, we associate often Jewish activities with basement rooms and exposed pipes, but I guess it isn't required by rabbinic law. So
I associate it more with gymnasiums.
Right. So actually, the addition there is just like the additions that every other religious institution has made.
Right.
And it's quite nice, but it does, of course, mean that there's a certain expense for keeping up a larger facility, and so it is a little bit of an investment, and it makes it harder to run a larger facility than a smaller one.
Okay.
So yeah, in that respect, it may actually be a difficulty, but on balance, I think it was a necessary addition, and it's a good thing, and I think that it will also become the locus for more cultural events, which will. I know, for instance, Debbie Malletz hopes to start a concert series, and I certainly hope that we can do something like that. So I would say that it does. It has the possibility of making the synagogue into more of a sort of cultural and community institution, and I think that does play an important part in its future. Because I think if the synagogue has any chance of attracting Jewish members of the community who are not currently part of the temple, it will probably be on the basis of cultural activities and community activities rather than just religious activities. That's my own guess. I mean, just thinking about people that I know, and students too. I'm not so. I spoke about the kind of religious revival among students, but I don't think that is maybe the the most important trend, and I think that it's very possible for a lot of reasons. It's possible that there will be more Jewish students at Ball State. That could very well happen, and they would be attracted to the synagogue, I think, as much on the basis of cultural activities as religious ones. That's right.
You mentioned one of your New Year's resolutions, so let me push that a little bit. If you had a Raphael Crystal wish list for the future of Temple Bethel, what kinds of things would be on your list?
Well, personally, for me, as I said, I've had this ongoing project of writing music for the Passover Seder, and so I want to get back to that, because I haven't really added to that in the past few years. The past few years I've been quite busy with things at Ball State, and so I haven't actually written music for the synagogue. So I think that's what I should do, is concentrate on that. There's also, we've talked about my writing music for a Friday evening service, and that's a whole other project that might materialize. But I think that it would be better for me to think more about the Passover Seder, because that's something that's in progress. And we now have something that we call the Muncie Haggadah, and it's a unique ritual, actually.
Okay.
But I also think that the concert series that Debbie Mallitz has been talking about, and I've also been talking about too, is something that we should do. It's a nice little venue, and so I think there should be a series of concerts and lectures that might have some lectures and some things on Jewish subjects, some on just general things of general interest. Sort of like the 92nd Street Y.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's exactly what came to mind.
Without a pool.
Yeah,
it's the Y without a pool.
92nd Street Y without full-page ads in the New York Times.
But one thing that Muncie doesn't have right now, or that it could use, is a small concert venue. There aren't that many of them, and so it would be, I think, it could become a very viable thing.
Let me go to one of the macro issues that's come up in, actually, in every interview I've ever done, and that is the issue of a full-time rabbi. Is that something that concerns you a great deal? As we're still dealing with student rabbis, and that may have a bit of a precarious future as far as whatever Hebrew Union's plans may be, that there are a number of people who are trying to figure out plans to perhaps employ a full-time rabbi.
Well, I think I don't have very developed ideas about that, but my guess is that it seems very unlikely that it could be afforded.
Well, it's more plans to try to do something perhaps with Ball State and with the Lilly Foundation as far as the funding stuff. So it's kind of a grant possibility and a Ball State possibility, a Temple possibility, with all three working up something of a cooperative nature that might result in having a full-time rabbi. Of course, the full-time rabbi issue was a major issue when I did these interviews 23 years ago, and now doing them 23 years later, a number of people I've spoken with, when I talk about these wish lists, the first thing they go at is, well, we really need to have a spiritual leader for the congregation 24/7.
Well, that probably would be a good idea. I would say again that for someone like myself, because of my unique trajectory, the situation with the student rabbi has been probably congenial.
Okay.
And I also think it's got its pluses because it then forms a relationship with the outside world.
Right.
And it really brings someone in and then going back and forth to Cincinnati, and I think that actually is a broadening thing. Plus, I think that the student rabbis that I've seen have been interesting because they are at an interesting stage in their life, and they usually their point of view is not yet completely formed.
Right.
So I actually think that they form an interesting part of that community, and it also gives the congregation itself quite a bit of independence, and it means that a lot of things devolve on the members of the congregation. So I would say it's an interest. It's got its interesting pros and cons. Because who would the full-time rabbi be? What kind of a person would it be? Would that person also teach at Ball State? Would it then become? I mean, yes, you could sort of see it sort of being like the radio station. Where, but that has. That has its pros and cons.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you mentioned the radio station because I certainly learned in my 15 years in the provost position that the radio station and the television station could use a vast influx of cash, to say nothing of major endowments, which of course is also true at Temple Bethel.
Right. And so instead, what they've evolved is the way of making use of the university as a way of staying in business. And that I think that's great because it means that we have certain services we wouldn't have. But it comes at a price too, because it's then not a separate institution.
Okay, well, my last question that we touched on a bit while we were reflecting and having coffee before we began our conversation is my working hypothesis, and that is if you did not have the Ball State faculty, and if you did not have the people who are affiliated with Ball, Ball Memorial Hospital, that there might not be enough of a there to have a Temple Bethel. I'd like to get your response to that.
No, I think it's probably true. As I said, it's not only Temple Bethel. If there weren't the Ball State University and the Ball Memorial Hospital, the whole city would be very different.
Yeah. Okay, well, is there anything else you'd like to add? This has been wonderful, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. But I always give my people I'm interviewing an opportunity to add anything they'd like to add of a general nature as far as reflections, etc., before we end the interview.
Well, I think that for me, as I've said, it's certain things have come together to create an interesting opportunity, and so it's been for me the fact that the Jewish community has been here and has the form that it has actually turned out to be a very enriching experience. And I think that the past of the Muncie Jewish community is interesting, and it's certainly worth studying. The future of it is, as always, very hard to predict.
Thank you very, very much.